They were high school sweethearts building a better life together.
My dad was a father that you would just dream of having. Same thing with my mom.
We decided, we're going to buy a home. And this one in Calypso Lane, we kept coming back to it.
Until a neighborhood dispute spiraled out of control.
This is trespassing. You're going to jail for that, asshole.
It was a testosterone fight that just wouldn't stop. And it just got worse and worse.
And when the battle leaves one of them dead, police must determine whether it was justified or a final act of revenge.
People are screaming, "The shooter's in the house!"
We should not be afraid of being killed by our neighbors.
On September 24th, 2011, it's a quiet evening in the bedroom community of Canyon Country, California, until the sheriff's office receives an alarming call around 3 a.m.
911?
Yes, my neighbor. Somebody got shot.
Do you know who was shot?
I don't know their names. I heard 2 shots and then ran up there.
Deputies arrive minutes later to find a chaotic scene.
There's a crowd of neighbors. They're in their pajamas. Everybody's screaming, yelling. There's chaos.
People are screaming, "The shooter's in the house! The shooter's in the house!" They're pointing and yelling at this house.
The arriving deputy sheriffs didn't know what was going on. They perceived a person that had been shot laying very close to the front door.
They were told that the suspect was armed and was still inside the house. Some of the neighbors were hysterical.
Realizing how dangerous the situation is, the officers immediately call for backup and secure the area.
They were trying to figure out who the victim was, where the shots had come from, and what to do about it. This was about one of the most bizarre, frightening experiences they had had. They still had a potential active shooting situation. Their policy and protocol was not to let in treating paramedics.
They'll stage, but they will not come to the scene until law enforcement tells them that it's safe.
The victim needed to be moved out of the potential kill zone onto the driveway, so the people that were administering aid helped drag him to what they believed to be a safer area.
While medics try to stabilize the victim, arriving officers learn the shooter is believed to be in the house and set up a perimeter.
They had their guns drawn, and they were ready to shoot anybody that opened the front door.
By this time, law enforcement has been able to identify the victim on the ground.
There's a man bleeding out. His wife is there. She tells police, "This is my husband. This is Tony Davis."
Raised in Glendale, California, Anthony Davis was instilled with a blue-collar work ethic from an early age.
Tony learned roofing when he was in high school. He was a roofer. And he ran his own little business for a while.
High school is also where he'd meet the love of his life, Cindy.
I was 15 and Tony was 16. I used to ride my horse up through town, and I guess I caught his attention. There was one day I was walking, and I hear him come out, and I knew that boy liked me. And that's where it started.
It would take 11 years and 2 children for Tony and Cindy to make it official.
We first moved in together when I was 17 and Tony was 18, I believe. I worked in retail for a while, then went on to office management. So started having babies at age 20. My son was my firstborn, and then my daughter 4 years later.
And we were just all a tight-knit family.
Tony and Cindy worked hard to provide for their family, and Tony moved on from working as a roofer to become a truck driver. But in 1991, tragedy struck.
At 35, he decided he was going to go and get his CDL and drive a truck. He did okay there, but he had an accident during those years, and he about lost his leg. He had a crush injury is what he had.
It was a really, really serious injury. that caused him to have to undergo several surgeries.
After the wreck, it took 5 years for Tony to recover well enough to walk, but he would never be able to drive a truck again.
Tony was in his late 30s. He had to reinvent himself. He had to provide for his family and put clothing on his children's backs.
Tony enrolled in college at Cal State University Northridge and began a career in teaching. The Davises decided to make another change as well.
2003 is when we decided, we're going to buy a home. Every day when Tony got off work, he would go hunting. And this one in Calypso Lane, we kept coming back to it.
He just said, this is it. And he took my mom up there and it became a dream come true. And when we walked in, my dad said, this is going to be our house.
This was the Davises' dream home. It was the first home that they had bought together as a married couple.
But almost 9 years later, the Davises' neighborhood has become a crime scene after Tony was found shot in front of the house next door. The gunman is believed to be holed up inside, and police have the area surrounded.
The deputy sheriff was trying to make commands for the person inside, or persons, to reveal themselves, to come out of the house, to give up, lay down their weapons.
They're armed and ready, and they have no idea what to expect.
Coming up, as paramedics try to save Tony's life, police come face to face with an assailant.
They were very nervous about what he's going to do.
Because it happened very fast.
"51-year-old Tony Davis has been found shot in his Santa Clarita neighborhood. Police are in a standoff with the gunman, and EMTs are fighting to save Tony's life amidst the active crime scene.
They didn't know what the situation was on the inside of the house, other than at least one person who had a gun who had just shot somebody was on the inside.
But just as officers prepare to storm the house, the door suddenly opens.
The, at this point, alleged shooter acts very bizarrely. He's not coming out. He's not listening to orders to come out. He opens the door and he says, "You come in."
Which they weren't quite sure was an invitation or a threat.
They can see that he's not armed, so they decide to go into the house, and they find 2 people inside.
They perceive a male and female in their 50s inside the house.
Police quickly handcuff the couple while they conduct a search of the house.
The first thing that happens is the man, the suspected shooter, complains that his cuffs are too tight. So as one of the deputies is loosening the grip of the cuffs, he blurts out something rather unusual. He says, "This is the first time I've had to discharge my weapon in anger, and I was in the Army."
Once the deputies made entry into the house, they did a protective sweep. They made sure there was no other imminent threat.
In the course of that, they see a shotgun sitting on the couch. Apparently no attempt to try to hide this weapon. There it is.
Officers transport them both to the Santa Clarita Valley Sheriff's Station for questioning. The couple is identified as 51-year-old Lonnie Paul Tracy and his wife Sandra.
They felt that while they sorted things out, the safest course would be to take them back to the station out of potential harm of angry neighbors, etc.
Meanwhile, paramedics outside are trying to keep Tony alive, but his injuries prove to be too severe.
He had a big gaping hole in his chest. I did not see the hole that was in his back until after the coroner arrived and when they turned him over.
They did everything they could to try and save his life, but that was a tough road to hoe.
Tony's family is devastated by the news of his death.
You're in shock. And the only one I wanted was my daughter. I didn't know what to do.
I just had fallen asleep. And I got woken up by my husband. He goes, "Your mom called." There was a voicemail, and it was my mom screaming. And at that point in time, I knew that my dad had died.
While the coroner removes Tony's body for an autopsy, Detectives Gene Okada and Gib Anderson are assigned to the case and begin searching the home of the shooter, Lonnie Tracy.
One of the first things they noticed was that the Tracy's home sticks out like a sore thumb. It's kind of an eyesore.
There was a 6-foot-high fence that paralleled the walkway. That was unusual.
It didn't bear any resemblance to most fences. It did have some kind of tactical bearing to it.
It's what law enforcement would call a kill zone, because you're enclosed between the garage and this fence.
An examination of the walkway turns up several pieces of evidence.
I saw 2 shell casings, maybe about 2-3 feet in front of the front door. I saw blood, and I saw the drag marks, so they had pulled into the front of the garage.
They also noticed that the home was outfitted with 4 surveillance cameras and a makeshift security system.
There was an extension cord running from the garage, and it connected by power this infrared light.
The infrared light was on the fence and pointed toward the Davises' home. It seemed intentional.
And inside the Tracy's home, detectives find a small room that appears to be some kind of command center.
In that side room is all this technology for surveillance cameras and stacks and stacks and stacks of tapes and photographs and documents, as if someone from the CIA lived in this home.
He had what I think is commonly known as a splitter, so he could see 4 cameras at once, and there was a monitor that was on.
At this point in an investigation, investigators would typically collect all of the evidence and send it to a forensic lab.
Based on their extreme security measures targeting the Davis family, the Tracys seem to be acting as though the Davises are their mortal enemies. And Cindy Davis tells detectives there's a very good reason why.
As it turns out, there was a lot of bad blood between these 2 families, the Davis family and the Tracy family, and Cindy Davis actually says that she had a feeling that something exactly like this was going to happen.
When I talked to the victim's wife, it was almost like, now what? What's going to happen next? She had her guard up, but she was able to talk and tell us the story that had been happening between her and neighbors.
Coming up, investigators learn the details of a vicious rivalry that's been building for years.
Lots of volatility between the 2, things that have been done to each other.
They were 2 peas in a pod. They just couldn't let things go.
Police investigating the death of Tony Davis have learned that the shooting might be the result of an ongoing feud with his neighbor, Lonnie Paul Tracy. According to Cindy Davis, the dispute started a couple of years after they moved into the neighborhood in 2003.
She tells them that they never really liked each other that much, the 2 families, perhaps in the beginning when they were new neighbors. But there was an incident.
Tony's style was easygoing, and we did have an issue when we first moved there about a bowing fence a little bit. And so he went over and he knocked on the neighbor's door, which there was no answer. So he decided to leave a little, I believe it was a Post-it note, and said, "Hi, this is your neighbor. Could you please not lean the tire up against the fence?" I mean, it was a huge tire. It wasn't like a car tire. It was more like a really big semi-tire.
Cindy says the Tracys never moved the tire, but a little while after that, there was an attempted break-in late at night.
There was another incident involving my son. He heard something in the garage. And he had came and woke Tony and I up, and we went out there, and you heard the neighbor's door close. We went in the garage. Nothing was missing, but there was definitely somebody there.
And Cindy tells investigators that over the next few years, things only got stranger.
We would come home from work, and there would be citations on our door from animal control stating that our German Shepherds were running wild in the neighborhood. And it would be like, that's not true.
One of the citations claimed that the Davises' dog jumped the fence and tried to bite a child.
But according to Cindy, their dog was not on the property, not outside their own home on the date and time that Mr. Tracy insisted that this happened.
We went down to the animal control and addressed the issue and just said, this isn't true. What do you need me to do? And it's like, who are these people? And they were relentless. And being that there was never no proof, it was basically just dropped.
Once again, Tony tried to talk to Lonnie, but he wouldn't even open the door.
He wasn't like a person you could go and have a conversation with him and ask him, what am I doing that offends you? You know, let's work this out like two grown adults. It wasn't that way. Instead, he would do these crazy things.
Cindy says that by 2007, the citations had gotten out of hand, and Lonnie had started recording their alleged infractions.
Some of those complaints could be something like somebody's lawnmower went 2 feet over the line, a dirt clod was found in the backyard that they wanted held as evidence.
This is trespassing after he's been warned with a court order. He's been told 3 times. His name is Anthony Davis. That's him. That's what he just did. Police are being called. Go call the police.
Our trash cans were in public view, and it is a city ordinance that you shouldn't have trash cans in public view. But if you drive around Santa Clarita, Glendale, LA, you're going to see somebody's trash can. And most people don't care.
But when she and Tony discovered the windshield of their car had been shattered, they decided it was time to fight fire with fire.
They were frankly fed up, and they did fight back at times. There's no doubt about it.
The Santa Clarita Valley Station personnel had many phone calls, letters, etc., with both neighbors making accusations against the others.
That only made matters worse.
Tony had gotten his bachelor's degree, and I decided that we were going to have a little party at our home. So we invited some of his colleagues and some few family members and set the backyard up really nice. And we're out there having a good time. And the next thing I know, Tracy next door picks up his blower and he just starts blowing, and the dirt is just coming over into our yard.
My dad just simply walked over there and asked him, "What are you doing?" And no response, just a blower, and more dust came up. I think Mr. Paul Tracy was trying to antagonize my father, and when he didn't get any type of reaction that he wanted, things progressively got worse.
The final straw came that June, when Cindy says they caught Lonnie taking pictures of them.
My dad and I, we were just sitting on one of the walls in the front yard, and we were just talking. I don't remember what we were talking about, but Mr. Tracy came out and just started taking pictures of us. And my dad just simply looked at me and said, "Jamie, let's go inside."
He had more family photos of Tony and I and my family than I probably ever have. It was just nuts. And so we went and we got a restraining order.
However, the Tracys responded by taking out a restraining order against them.
While Cindy and Tony Davis were a united front in their allegations against the Tracys, so were the Tracys in their allegations against the Davises.
All they did was take the same words that Tony and I put and put their name on it, word for word.
Instead of putting an end to the hostilities, the restraining orders only added fuel to the fire. but no one could have known how hot it would get.
It just festered. Just like any feud, it gets getting worse and worse.
Coming up, the battle between the Tracys and the Davises finally explodes.
Neither of these men had the emotional tools to say, wait a minute, this is insane.
Investigators in Santa Clarita, California, are learning about the volatile feud that may have caused 51-year-old Lonnie Tracy to shoot his neighbor, Tony Davis.
The guys had had petty complaints back and forth. Primarily, that's the ones that were keeping this feud alive. And this had gone on, I was kind of shocked to learn, for probably at least 7 years.
So what you have here, besides a failure to communicate, is you have essentially grown men acting like 7-year-olds.
Despite restraining orders against both families, the feud only continued to intensify.
There was an increasing escalation between one side and the other. It was sometimes bizarre.
Get the fuck off of our property.
I'm not on the property, I'm on the sidewalk.
You're a fucking maniac.
Just call the police.
On another occasion, Cindy was gardening. She puts her keys up on a fence on a hook. She returns to get the keys. They're not there.
I'm looking in the flower bushes, running around thinking, what'd I do with these keys, knowing darn well I'd put them where I'd put them.
The next day, Cindy discovered someone had vandalized her car. Certain it was the Tracys, Cindy tried filing another report with the sheriff's department.
Unless you have proof, law enforcement can't get involved in something like, I think he did it.
Just like it happened with the restraining order, this caused a flurry of reports in response. Every time the Davises tried to report something to police in their own defense, Tracy's fired back with their own report.
Some of those were like vandalizing cars, scratching cars, changing their location of the mailbox simply to hassle the other person's parking, those kinds of things.
It almost made it seem like the Tracys just sat around thinking of ways to get back at the Davis family. It made it seem as if they were mean, angry people.
Cindy tells police that by early 2011, she and Tony had decided the only way to stop Lonnie Tracy was to catch him in the act.
The Davis family, because they felt that they had been victimized over and over again, decided to do something about it, and so they installed pretty state-of-the-art surveillance around the entire perimeter of their house.
Once again, he just one-ups them and installs his own surveillance cameras. It's almost like anything you can do, I can do better.
Add to that, he's placed flood lamps all around his house, which are aimed right in Tony Davis's and Cindy Davis's bedroom.
Cindy says that's when their dispute took a bizarre turn.
Lonnie Tracy had a bunch of really bizarre posters made and intentionally put them where the Davises couldn't help but see them.
He writes on these posters the most rude, obscene, lewd, vile, and absolutely imbecilic statements about Tony Davis that you can imagine.
If you want to see a whale, if the tours start tomorrow. I mean, it was terrible.
It was a little disturbing that someone would take the time to do that.
Still, the Davises tried to keep the peace. But when Lonnie installed his infrared light, Tony finally decided enough was enough.
Even though the infrared light couldn't be seen with the naked eye, it actually did disrupt the Davises' camera signals. That's exactly why Tony Davis went to his neighbor's house 3 a.m. the night of the shooting.
I'd fallen asleep watching soap operas, and he had went into the security cameras and noticed that one was being blocked out, and he had woke me up and said, "Cindy, I'm going to go next door and just ask him to turn off the lights. I just said, okay.
She didn't know what he meant by that, and then she went back to sleep.
A few minutes later, Cindy would be awakened once again, this time by 2 gunshots.
When she realized that her husband was not in the house, she ran out, went immediately to the Tracy's front yard.
Cindy saw her husband laying within the perimeter of the L-shaped fence. He had been shot, he was crying, and he was still alive.
I went to go to Tony, and the door flung open, and the man pointed the shotgun at me and told me to get the fuck off his property.
She ran back, dialed 911. She was hysterical at this time.
Cindy agrees to hand over all of the surveillance video they recorded that night. Investigators are hopeful it will give them a clearer picture of exactly what happened.
Now that detectives have heard Cindy's side of the story, they head back to the station to get more information from the Tracys.
Coming up, cold-blooded murder or justifiable self-defense.
She said the next-door neighbors were the neighbors from hell.
I've never lived next to such horrible beings in my life.
Cindy Davis has told police about an alarming feud that left her husband Tony dead. Now it's time for them to talk to the shooter, Lonnie Tracy, and his wife, Sandra. 9 hours after the shooting, detectives sit down with Sandra Tracy to get her side of the story.
According to her, they weren't the ones harassing the Davises. It was the other way around.
I've just called them the neighbors from hell forever.
But as much as the two families hated each other, they seemed to have a few things in common.
Lonnie was once employed as a commercial artist, and then he had a very, very serious accident.
He crashed into a sign with his knee and tore the meniscus. We've been living in workers' compensation hell for the last 9 years.
By all rights, they should have been best friends. They were living right next to each other. They were similarly aged. They both had had devastating workplace injury where they were on long-term workers' comp, off of work, with their days open.
Sandra had many of the same complaints that Cindy did, except in her version, it was the Davises who were the instigators.
She said they erected that fence in front of their house so that people from the street couldn't look into their bedroom.
Sandra tells investigators that when the Davises installed cameras to watch them, they had no choice but to respond in kind.
They had to put up their own surveillance systems to counteract the neighbor's surveillance system. The feud was back and forth, the petty things that they did to each other.
Sandra claims Tony Davis became increasingly volatile, leading to an incident in April of that year.
Lonnie had filed a police report claiming that Tony assaulted him while he was mowing the front lawn.
And then all of a sudden he'd feel something hit him on the head and shoulders, and he was throwing things at him. He just picked up mounds of dirt that had rocks and crap in it, and he was spraying my husband with the hose.
So there you go again, folks. There's a fucking water hose right there.
Mr. Tracy thought that constituted assault and battery, and the DA had declined to prosecute.
From that time on, April, Davis has been very emboldened that he can get away with anything. And just more and more stuff started happening. I've been very afraid of this man. I've told the police this for years.
But when it comes to the shooting, Sandra tells investigators she didn't actually see it happen.
Sandra's story was she was sleeping, and she knows that her husband is also a night owl, and he was probably tinkering around in his room with model cars.
I had gone in to go to the bathroom. All of a sudden, he's screaming at me, "Call the police! Call the police!" I said, "What's happening?" He says, "Somebody's out here. I'm hearing sounds. There's lights."
She runs back into the bedroom to call police, and describes what she hears as a loud banging.
Like either a pounding or something hit the door with a lot of force. A lot of force. It was very loud.
And then what happened next?
I hear shots. And I'm going, oh my God, what's happening? What's happening?
Her husband told her that someone was trying to break into her house, to the front door.
She immediately calls 911, and she's still on the phone with them when Lonnie starts screaming that he's shot the prowler.
She was not aware initially that it was, in fact, Mr. Davis.
Detectives aren't sure what to make of Sandra's story.
Was this a legal and case of self-defense, or was this a murder?
Since her statement was that she was in the bedroom, she heard the shots and came out, there was no reason to arrest her, so we let her go.
Unfortunately, her husband isn't as cooperative.
I would rather have an attorney present.
The fact that the deputies came into his home, they detained him at gunpoint. He seemed a little miffed that this is the way he was treated when he felt in his mind that he had acted appropriately.
Since investigators only have 48 hours from the time of arrest to file charges, they're faced with a decision.
We had the murder weapon. We also had Lonnie's statement that this is the first time that he's ever shot a gun in anger since the Army.
He certainly had hate and animus for his next-door neighbor.
After Mr. Tracy declined to speak to us, we directed the deputies to go ahead and book him for the charge of murder.
Police also charged Lonnie with assault for threatening Cindy Davis with a shotgun. Now they needed to make sure they had the evidence to prove it.
They start by going back through all of the complaints that had been filed with the sheriff's department.
It was really unbelievable to see just the volume of petty complaints back and forth over a period of approximately 7 years.
When you see the reports one after another through the years, you could see that it was building to some sort of climactic result or conclusion.
Investigators also pore over the endless hours of surveillance tape both families collected. And what they find is revealing.
In this case, surveillance tape was paramount, and it was the Fort Knox of evidence.
He was following my wife. We've had all kinds of vandalism. There's only one place it comes from. Anthony Davis.
Coming up, Lonnie Tracy takes the stand in his own defense. But will it help his case or hurt it?
You always want somebody to give a statement so you could foresee what they're going to say. Here, I had no idea.
In October of 2012, Lonnie Tracy stands trial for the murder of his neighbor, Tony Davis. The prosecution describes Lonnie as a man whose resentment drove him to do the unthinkable.
He had this pent-up frustration. He was basically homebound. He was in a lot of pain. Unfortunately, the person that he was able to spew his venom at was his neighbor, Mr. Davis.
Prosecutors used physical evidence from the scene, along with a substantial amount of video surveillance evidence to describe what happened the night of the shooting.
The video for the Tracy residence, you saw Mr. Davis arrive. You could see that he was near the L-shaped fence.
Some of it was grainy, but you still get a pretty clear picture, and it looked like he did act to unplug an infrared light that was mounted on the Tracy's wall.
The surveillance tape shows Tony Davis actually walking up to the front door.
Although the cameras didn't pick up the actual shooting, detectives testify that Lonnie could easily see it was Tony through the monitors in his house.
It appeared the final straw in Tracy's mind when Mr. Davis had the gall to come into his yard and disrupt the device that he had put up to disrupt the Davises' video system, and that was more than he could bear.
Detectives believe that Lonnie grabbed his gun with the intention of going to the front door and shooting Tony. And when he shot him, the bullet hit him in the chest.
You can see some haze, which looks like pellets from a shotgun. Then you see Mr. Davis trying to apparently flee as best he could through the front walkway.
They say that's when Lonnie shot Tony in the back, and the medical examiner's report seems to back up that theory.
However, the defense insists that Lonnie was well within his rights to shoot an intruder. And in a surprising move, Lonnie even decides to speak out on his own behalf.
His version was that he heard a noise in the front yard. He took his shotgun to protect himself and his family.
And he can't really make out what's going on because the light's flashing through the windows. And he doesn't know who it is. And no one's ever shown up at his doorstep at 3 a.m.
He testified that he opened the door and that he was bull rushed into the interior of his house.
He ultimately felt that he had to shoot the person. He didn't realize it was his neighbor until later.
Lonnie claims he never threatened Cindy Davis with the gun. She just interpreted it that way.
He told her simply to get off the property and that law enforcement was about to arrive.
He said essentially the same thing about his comment to police, that this was the first time he had shot his weapon since the Army. It's just that they misinterpreted him.
He was simply stating that he had shot his gun, not that he had done it with any malice or anger.
But the prosecution is quick to poke holes in Lonnie's story.
Mr. Tracy didn't even bother to prepare his statement and make sure that it at least was consistent with facts.
All the forensic evidence, the shell casings, the blood, was all discovered outside the home, completely discounts Lonnie Tracy's conviction that he had to fight off this prowler inside his home.
Not only could he have seen Tony on the cameras, Lonnie would have known that it was Tony the second he opened the door.
For him to say that he didn't recognize him was less than truthful.
Prosecutors argued that Lonnie was just waiting for his chance to get Tony, and that night, opportunity presented itself.
Mr. Tracy executed him. He was his own judge, jury, and executioner.
The jury agrees. On November 7th, 2012, they find Lonnie Tracy guilty of first-degree murder.
Mr. Tracy was subsequently sentenced 50 years for the murder and another 14 years for the attempted murder of Mrs. Davis.
What I remember about the trial is what a coward he was. Couldn't look you in the eyes. Never had an ounce of remorse. How it was, he didn't do nothing. It was everybody else's fault.
Justice seems to have been served, but it's cold comfort for the Davis family, whose dreams had been shattered by a simple neighborhood argument.
These two guys that should have been best friends ended up destroying each other's lives. One literally, and the other one is going to be spending the rest of his life in prison. Over what? Nothing.
My father always turned the cheek and was a man of respect. And for what has happened with that man, could never bring back my father, but that man never deserves to be somebody else's neighbor.
Tony's not here physically. And that's pain. That hurts. But he lets us know he's here. So, and that gives you some sort of peace.
two outdoorsmen devoted to the same piece of land.
It was beautiful. It was like God's country.
This is Montana. Montana has a strong, strong heritage of having a firearm, protecting your life and your property.
They started really kind of butting heads. We always felt someone was going to pull the trigger.
Their feud would escalate into an armed standoff that left one of them dead.
One of them's down. We need somebody up there now.
But is it a case of self-defense or a cover-up for murder?
He said the next time you see him, you're going to see him in a body bag.
Friday, October 18th, 2013. It's a beautiful fall day in the Flathead National Forest, located near Great Falls, Montana.
It is sort of a gateway to a very desirable wilderness area that people here just love to flock to, and that would be the Rocky Mountain front.
But at 12:20 p.m., the tranquility is disturbed when Montana police receive a call from Tanny Converse, a resident of Diamond Bar X.
911, what is your emergency?
Hi, we need the Lewis and Clark County Sheriff to come up the Upper Dearborn, up Falls Creek, having a altercation with a neighbor, and he's just ranting and raving at us.
Diamond Bar X is a remote community out in the woods. It's over 2 hours away from the sheriff's office in Helena, so dispatch sends a deputy from Augusta.
But before the deputy can get to the location, Tanny calls again.
She apparently walked to a neighbor's house to call 911, and in the time that passed, the fight had escalated.
The altercation with the neighbor, there were shots fired, and one of them's down. So one of them's down, so we need somebody up there now.
When the deputy finally arrives, he finds a man lying motionless near a wooden gate. On the ground beside him is a .38 caliber pistol.
The gun was found laying on the ground 6 to 10 inches from his right hand.
It looked like some sort of gunfight. He'd been shot already once in the chest and lost a lot of blood.
It took some time to get the ambulance personnel there, and they looked at him and said that he had expired.
The dead man is identified as 53-year-old Tim Newman, a longtime resident of the area.
Tim was a gentle soul. He cared for people, helped them out. He was born in California, and his dream was always to live in Montana. His family is in southern Montana, the ranchers and the cowboys, this type of thing.
In 2001, Tim Newman had finally fulfilled his lifelong dream.
He moved to the Great Falls area. He'd been married and divorced once already and had a daughter who lived in Alaska. So he was looking to make a fresh start. He found a cabin that was a bit of a fixer-upper in Diamond Bar X. The area had been named after an old dude ranch that was there before the area was developed.
Tim was drawn to the area, I think, like the rest of us. We liked the outdoors. There was a lot of opportunity up there to hunt, fish, backpack, lots of horse riding trails in the area.
Tim found work in Great Falls, where he met his second wife, Jackie, in 2003.
He was doing some electrical for my niece and her husband, and they got to chit-chatting and found out he was single and I was single, so we did phone tag for a while. And we finally met up at a neutral place, and that was the end of that story.
They had a lot in common. Jackie was also divorced with a kid, and she worked in the food service industry for the local schools.
2 weeks later, He slipped an engagement ring on my finger, and then he stayed with me. We were married that May.
Jackie also fell in love with Tim's cabin. The couple spent most of their weekends there finishing renovations.
We made a masterpiece out of it. Going up there and overlooking the valley. I mean, there's a creek down below. There's a cliff like 2 feet away. But it was like God's country. Just, oh, I can't explain the beauty of it all.
I own and build log cabins for a living, and he was a journeyman electrician. So our relationship started out primarily work-related. Didn't take long, and we became friends.
Tim was a guy that always you could count on to help out, and we were all like that. Everybody just pitched in, and a little community.
For Tim and Jackie, it was paradise. But one area in particular held a special place in Tim's heart.
Not far from Diamond Bar X is the Bob Marshall Wilderness, which is one of the most spectacular nature preserves in the country. Locals call it the Bob.
The Bob Marshall's over 1 million acres with no roads, no nothing, so you can go back in there and pretty well lose yourself. When he bought that piece of ground up there with that cabin, what he was looking for was to find a place where he could stage himself for hunting season.
All the trails and roads that led you to the national forest went through neighboring properties. And it was understood, and people enjoyed that. They liked to see their neighbors, go by and would wave and see the horseback trips heading into the mountains.
But that all changed on October 18th, 2013.
It was about a month into the hunting season. Tim and his buddy Joe Aberley were planning another hunting trip together.
Tim and I were going to go into the mountains. He had his horse, and I had mine. We had hunted a couple weeks before in that area. There was a lot of deadfall on the trails. So before hunting season, everyone goes in their area and saws the trees all the way.
But the trip wouldn't go as planned. Tim had been killed in an apparent gunfight, and police don't have to look very far to find the man who shot him.
They find another man at the scene who's armed as well. He says he owns the property on the other side of the fence and had every right to shoot Tim Newman.
Coming up, locked gates and death threats.
He said, I could shoot you right now, and there's a lot of places in the mountains where somebody would not be found.
"53-year-old Tim Newman has been found shot to death near Diamond Bar X in rural Montana. The news quickly spreads around the tight-knit community.
It was just devastating. I was shocked, and I just had to sit down for a few minutes and kind of wrap my head around it.
The police were still at the scene, so one of Tim's friends wound up being the one to call Jackie to let her know what happened.
He said, Tim's been shot. He's kind of breaking up, and I said, he's been shot, is he okay? And he said, no, he's not okay, he's dead. It was one of those days that you try to forget, but you never do.
It's hard for anyone to believe someone would kill a man like Tim, but police already have the shooter in custody.
His name is Joe Campbell, and his wife is the one who called 911. He claims that Tim tried to shoot him first.
Joe had a gun. He described how it happened, that he had to fire in self-defense.
He did not seem nervous or scared or upset. He seemed very concerned, but he seemed to be able to tell his story in a coherent, cohesive manner.
67-year-old Joe Campbell and his wife Tanny are also longtime residents of Diamond Bar X.
Joe moved into the area in the late 90s. He bought a piece of property like the rest of us did. He built a cabin on it. It did become his full-time residence.
He had worked for the Forest Service in Colorado, then left that job and came up to Montana and bought into that area.
Much like the Newmans, Joe and Tanny had immediately fallen in love with the area.
They walked up the mountain and hiked and horseback ride, and we used to see him back there, and we were cordial.
Joe loved the area so much, in fact, that he began purchasing as much of it as he could.
When the original owner that developed the Diamond Over X passed away, Campbell and another resident bought the remaining property. This property is worth millions.
He ended up owning approximately 300 acres at that point, and it was scattered throughout the development, between the development and the forest.
After that, Joe's attitude towards his neighbors seemed to change.
When he got the 300 acres, he was deciding he was going to limit people's access in and out of the forest.
There was a lot of Forest Service land, but to get to that, you had to cross Campbell's land. And that was a contention between the neighbors if they wanted to enjoy the public land. Joe Campbell claimed that they were trespassing on land that he bought.
Some neighbors fired back, calling the police to complain about Joe, and that's when he decided to up the ante.
Joe Campbell began to put padlocks and gates on places that didn't have padlocks and gates.
Joe's tactics made an enemy out of one neighbor in particular, Tim Newman.
Tim was upset about that because we used to just ride out there anytime, and we'd go for miles on the horses and see all the falls.
He felt that they had a historical easement, that they had the right to enjoy unfettered access to those areas to get to the public land.
Tim wasn't going to let Joe win without a fight.
Tim started cutting locks that Joe was putting up on gates to keep people out.
Tim was flexing his muscles by cutting the gates, saying, I'm going to go, I'm not going to go through the legal avenues.
Joe then retaliated by pressing charges against Tim.
We began to issue citations to Tim Newman for cutting those locks and the vandalism.
Tim pleaded not guilty, and the charges were later dismissed. That should have been the end of it, but Tim kept doing it, and that turned out to be a big mistake.
Joe definitely was a bully, and I think Tim was poking the bears, so to speak. I think he pushed him.
Joe tells detectives that the feud had continued for over 8 months. But things finally came to a head after he caught Tim trying to cut another one of his locks earlier that day.
Joe and his wife were out for a walk when they saw Tim with a pair of bolt cutters. He told them to stop.
Mr. Campbell had said that Mr. Newman had been taunting Mr. Campbell and Mr. Campbell's wife. He told her to call 911.
After Tanny leaves to go find a phone, things got even more heated. They were yelling back and forth at each other, and then it happened.
The story that Joe gave to the sheriff initially was that Tim had gone for his gun and that Joe had drawn his from his holster up and fired and shot Tim. He had started to roll over to shoot him, and that he had shot him the second time in the back.
It was self-defense. He felt that his life was in danger.
Given the history between the two of them and the charges against Tim, the shooting looked completely justified.
It did initially make sense to all of us who were investigating. The facts that Joe gave us looked plausible.
Coming up, investigators discover there is more to the story than meets the eye.
Joe Campbell had threatened Tim several times.
He wanted to become king of the mountain, and he was going to achieve that any way he could.
A feud over land rights in the Montana wilderness has left 53-year-old Tim Newman dead. So far, it looks like the man who shot him, 67-year-old Joe Campbell, was acting in self-defense.
We investigated the scene. We looked for the bullets. We took measurements. We photographed it, all of those kind of things.
They found a gun near Tim's body and bolt cutters by the fence, which was in line with the story Joe had told police. He seemed to have acted in accordance with Montana's Stand Your Ground laws.
The Stand Your Ground law is that you can defend your property if someone is what you think is going to cause bodily harm.
After detectives questioned Joe at the scene, they let him go. But not everyone is convinced he is telling the truth.
We were expecting he'd be arrested immediately, and he wasn't. And we were all very upset.
Tim wasn't the only one Joe had disagreements with. Over the years, he had several run-ins with other Diamond Bar ex-residents as well.
The neighbors and myself were worried that this guy did it once, he could do it twice.
Residents tell police that Joe Campbell had been using threats and intimidation to keep people off his land for years.
This was a community. They got along well. But when Joe Campbell got there, he just decided that there was a new sheriff in town and he was going to rule the roost.
He wanted to become king of the mountain, and he was going to achieve that any way he could. He pulled guns on people. He bullied people. He was just the kind of a guy that nobody wanted to be a friend with.
Tim's friend Joe Aberly tells investigators that he and his daughter had previously experienced Joe's violent streak firsthand.
We were riding a regular trail we always ride that would take us in front of Campbell's house or past his house, and he came out and challenged us with a shotgun and says, "You're not going past here." And I says, "Yes, I am." And my daughter says, "Dad, stop, he's going to shoot you in the back."
Joe did tell him, "I could shoot you right now, and there's a lot of places in the mountains where somebody would not be found."
Campbell came out this big, actually they call it a sweeper shotgun that you'd use for mob control or slaughtering people. And that's what Campbell presented and stopped these people from going in there.
But Tim Newman is the one who bore the brunt of Joe's animosity.
Joe Campbell had threatened Tim several times to his face and to other people. He threatened to kill him because he was crossing his land.
Tim told me that Mr. Campbell had drawn a weapon on him.
It may have started out with some type of bullying before he actually started pulling out pistols, but this has been going on for several years.
At the time, local police had tried to broker a peace between the two men, but there was only so much they could do.
Confronting people with a gun and behaving in a aggressive manner, that was our business. But as far as who had the right to go on the land, that's something that we could not solve.
We wrote letters saying we were concerned for everyone's safety up there.
We had 10 or 12 families involved in the original lawsuit. Every family put in X amount of dollars, and we gave it to the attorney to research deed access and prescriptive easements.
Unfortunately, a legal battle with a wealthy landowner proved too costly to continue.
Tim and a couple of the other neighbors decided they had had enough as far as the monetary part of it was, and said they were going to pursue other avenues.
Tim decided to cut the locks so he would get charged with trespassing and the case would go to court. Of course, that only made things worse.
The more that Tim Newman asserted his rights for the historical easement, the more that Joe Campbell became aggressive.
We always were concerned that it was going to escalate, and we always felt someone was going to pull the trigger.
Joe and Tim had finally been assigned a date to face each other in court, but it never took place.
The state prosecutor decided it was a civil case and the charges against Tim were dropped. The other residents felt like that was the final straw for Joe Campbell.
So on the morning of October 18th, Joe's neighbors believed he decided to take matters into his own hands.
Tim and his friend were out on the trails clearing brush for their hunting trip, and that's when Joe Campbell showed up.
Tim looked out there, and he said, "Oh, it's Campbell." He said, "I want to go talk to him a minute."
Tim knew that the gate was locked up above, and that was an access that Tim had been using and was upset that the lock was back on it. They had words.
He came back just within half a minute or so, very fast, and very distressed, Tim was. And I says, "What happened?" And he said, "Well, Joe threatened to kill me again."
A couple of hours later, Tim Newman was dead.
So had Joe really shot Tim in self-defense, or had he finally made good on his threats?
Coming up, autopsy results hinted a possible cover-up.
There are several things that just don't add up.
Police investigating the shooting death of Tim Newman have already questioned and released his longtime rival, Joe Campbell. But given the pair's ongoing dispute, they're no longer certain it was in self-defense.
It did not make sense to hear that Tim would have pulled a gun on Joe by any means. I definitely would have expected it the other way around.
Joe had already made threats multiple times.
I knew at that time that Joe Campbell murdered Tim.
Unfortunately, preliminary evidence appears to support Joe's account of the shooting.
There wasn't anything to dispute what Joe said. So Montana does have a law of stand your ground.
All the shooter has to do is say, "I was threatened," and say that Tim Newman pulled his weapon.
But there is one minor detail that doesn't fit.
Tim's hunting partner, Joe Aberley, told police that he was saddling their horses when he heard 2 gunshots. He and another neighbor, Mike Dunnington, ran over there and found Tim lying in front of the gate. His gun was on the ground beside him, but they immediately noticed something strange.
I says, "Mike, that gun is laying in front of Tim's right head." "Yeah, I see it, I see it." I said, "Listen, you know Tim is left-handed."
The gun was on his right side. I saw it there. He's left-handed. Now, I doubt if he was doing a cross draw.
If you're going to shoot a weapon, you want to be able to aim that weapon. So, no, it just wasn't logical.
So how did Tim's gun wind up in the wrong hand?
I do think that there's a good chance that that gun was placed there.
The medical examiner's report indicates another problem with Campbell's version of events.
In his first statement to police, Joe said that when Tim drew his gun, he shot him in the chest. He said that Tim had fallen to the ground and then attempted to roll over and fire his weapon, and that's when Joe shot him in the back. But the wounds didn't exactly support that. The autopsy showed that Tim had been shot twice. One bullet grazed him in the hand and then went through his shoulder. The other severed his spine, and that was the shot that killed him. And based on the medical examiner's report, that was also probably the first shot fired.
Was Campbell lying? Or had the 67-year-old simply misremembered what happened in the heat of the moment? On October 28th, 10 days after the shooting, investigators bring Joe Campbell in for a second interview. Campbell sticks by his story, insisting that Newman was the aggressor, both in their feud and on the day of the shooting.
Mr. Newman was following him on an ATV and taunting them. And they had made efforts to avoid Mr. Newman, but it persisted. And then they came to the fence where the shootings took place. He talked about being feeling threatened, that he felt his life was in danger.
It is his land. He is defending his property. This is Montana. Montana has a strong, strong heritage of having a firearm, protecting your life and your property with a firearm.
Detectives confront Campbell with the discrepancies between his story and the autopsy findings. But he has a simple explanation.
Joe reenacts the whole shooting for them. He shows them how Tim spun around and fell to the ground face first and then pushed himself up with his hands and elbows. He says when Tim tried to get up, he shot him in the back, causing Tim to roll down the hill, exposing his gun. Joe then adds another interesting detail.
As Mr. Newman lay there, he looked up and said, "You shouldn't have done that, Joe," after he was shot, which I thought was a very interesting thing to offer.
To determine what really happened, the sheriff's department will need to call in a forensics expert to reconstruct the shooting.
We weren't seeing any progress. So the delay was very hard. They couldn't tell us a lot. They just said, be patient, we have work to do.
Oh, that was so frustrating, and I had contact with the detective almost every day, just, why haven't they gotten him? Why haven't they gotten him? And she said, we have to dot our I's and cross our T's before we can actually make an arrest.
But before that can happen, the investigation suffers an unexpected setback.
A snowstorm came in and they weren't able to access the area for several months until the snow receded.
There's nothing anyone can do at that point but wait.
Coming up, beneath the snow, the truth lies waiting to be discovered.
The story we were told didn't match the forensics.
His legs were spread as if he were running when the bullet hit him.
It's May of 2014. 7 months have passed since the death of Tim Newman, and his friends are still reeling from the loss.
This had happened to a peaceful area where the neighbors were supposed to get along. It was consuming. It consumed everybody's mindset and their conversations.
Especially since the man who shot him, Joe Campbell, has yet to be charged with a crime.
He'd been free walking around after, shooting somebody. The community was devastated by it, but he was like, no big deal, today's another day.
We were concerned to go to our property. You were always looking over your shoulder.
Joe would be standing up on the hill, looking down on us working, and he'd be standing up there with a rifle in his hands.
The community began to have unrest because there was no resolution to what they felt we should be doing.
Winter snowstorms had put a hold on the investigation, but with the spring thaw came a chance to revisit the scene of the shooting.
So far, they only had Joe's version of what happened, and the medical examiner's findings didn't exactly line up. They had to go back to the area to find out what really happened.
We had a forensic scientist look at it, analyze where those bullets entered Tim Newman's body.
The scientist's name is William Schneck. He's a crime scene investigator with the Washington State Crime Lab. Using a mannequin and other specialized forensic tools, he attempts to recreate the shooting based on the evidence gathered so far.
According to Joe Campbell, he shot Tim first in the chest and then in the back. But the nature of Tim's injuries and the position of his body indicated exactly the opposite. Joe said the first shot spun Tim around, but the trajectory of the wounds didn't line up that way.
In fact, Schneck is able to determine that Tim Newman was running away from Joe Campbell when he shot him.
Tim was laying downhill from the gate. Tim's left hand was back, his right hand was forward, and his legs were spread as if he were running when the bullet hit him.
The first shot would have put Tim Newman down. It was in the spine and made him go down. The second shot went in through the shoulder, and you could take the stick or line them up and show where he was when he got shot.
The shooting reconstruction contradicts Joe Campbell's story in other ways, too.
If Tim had been crouched by the gate with his bolt cutters when he went for his gun, like Campbell said, he probably would have dropped them right there. But that's not where police found them.
The story we were told didn't match the forensics of what we now know.
On June 23, 2014, prosecutors filed charges against Joe Campbell. Along with the forensic evidence, they cite Joe's history of conflicts with his neighbors, especially Tim Newman.
The threats against Tim continued right up to his death. In fact, days before the shooting, Joe had made it clear he intended to kill him because the court had dropped the vandalism charges.
Joe Campbell called the judge and said, the next time you see Tim Newman, you're going to see him in a body bag.
Between all of that, the autopsy, and the forensic expert, they have a pretty solid case for murder.
It wasn't how Joe Campbell said it had happened. It wasn't a matter of self-defense, but it's up to a jury to decide.
Later that day, police arrest 68-year-old Joe Campbell for first-degree murder.
He was cooperative. He didn't fight. We had been at this for quite some time. I believe he knew that this day was coming.
One of the county attorneys called me and said they're going to arrest Campbell. And I says, thank you. It was a great relief to all of us.
It was one of the happiest days of my life.
At his arraignment, Joe pleads not guilty. The defense negotiates for his release pending trial. Instead, the judge sets his bond at $1 million.
Joe's lawyers were able to negotiate a lower bond of $300,000 using his house, valued at $680,000, as collateral.
The trial is set for November, a year after Tim Newman's death. But justice would have to wait.
It's taken them months to put together the evidence against Joe Campbell and even more time to bring the case to trial. They missed the November date, and then Joe's legal team changed, which delayed it for another year.
Coming up, Joe Campbell finally stands trial. But will a jury find him guilty?
We knew it was going to be a tough case to prove.
After numerous delays, Joe Campbell finally stands trial on February 15, 2016. More than 2 years after he shot and killed his neighbor, Tim Newman. Joe has already pled not guilty under Montana's Stand Your Ground laws, but prosecutors argue that the evidence proves he was not acting in self-defense.
The prosecution tried to portray Mr. Campbell as somebody who was very angry. They had brought up several witnesses who had said they'd had run-ins with Mr. Campbell over the years. And they also said that there was never these problems before Mr. Campbell arrived on the property.
It wasn't just a deal where they got into a heated argument and pulled guns on each other. This was years in the build-up. They didn't like each other very well, and they had other confrontations. And Joe had made comments to other neighbors and people that he was going to do these things to Tim, and he was able to carry it out.
Their star witness is forensic scientist William Schneck.
It was Schneck who reconstructed the shooting scene, confirming what the autopsy had found, which was that the first and fatal shot to Tim Newman was in the back. The placement of the body and Tim's gun being in the wrong hand, the prosecution argued, all added up to murder. Campbell shot Newman as he was turned away and then staged the scene to make it look like self-defense.
The best evidence against Joe Campbell was a forensic pathology report that showed, I believe, that it was beyond a shadow of a doubt how it really happened.
But the defense has its own expert, Dr. Vincent DeMeo, who lays out a different theory.
The defense expert says it's perfectly plausible that Tim could have been falling or jumping backwards when the first shot hit him in the hand and chest, followed by the second shot that hit him in the back.
He said, well, Tim was leaning backwards. But they said to lean that far backwards, you couldn't possibly stand on 2 feet, you'd fall over backwards. It didn't matter what they said. It didn't work.
Hoping the two experts might cancel each other out, the defense calls on Joe Campbell to tell his story in his own words.
He was emotional on the stand, describing how terrified he was in the moment that Tim reached for his gun, but he had to protect himself.
He's defending his land. He has someone who says that they can trespass and that he is using a firearm to protect his ground.
The crying, I thought, you lying SOB, you dirty SOB, all the bad things you can think. That was a most blatant lie.
I never really quite knew if the tears were real, but I think he came across as credible, and he only has to come across as credible to 1 or 2 people.
On March 3rd, after a 3-week trial, the case goes to the jury.
Well, I thought the prosecution had a very good case. We were cautiously optimistic that he'd be found guilty.
But the jury doesn't agree.
They deliberated for 13 hours, and then they came back and told the judge that they were hopelessly deadlocked.
I was with my wife and Tim's wife, and we just couldn't believe it.
When the jury was polled, they felt like it was a negligent homicide. They weren't comfortable going with the homicide because they felt there were some mitigating factors. The defense had done a good job at creating some doubt.
Now the state had to determine whether they would pursue a retrial or drop the case.
The detective asked me, do you want to retry this case? What do you think? And I said, yes, I do. Because I honestly thought we had him this time.
The state decided they would retry him, and so they geared up to do that.
The second trial would never take place.
Joe Campbell agreed to plead no contest to a charge of negligent homicide. It carries a 20-year sentence, but that sentence was suspended as long as Joe agreed to certain stipulations.
He would have to stay 10 miles away from Falls Creek. He could no longer carry a firearm, I believe, and also he was to sell his property at the site.
He was banished from the land that he killed a man over. For the 20 years that he's on probation, he can't come within 10 miles of that property.
Joe Campbell's reign of terror may be over, but the outcome offers little consolation to friends and family of the victim.
Some of the people who are on Tim Newman's side felt that that wasn't enough, but that was beyond our control. There was people that felt that Joe Campbell shouldn't have got anything, but I believe we did the right thing.
I believe Campbell has no conscience. He had no remorse whatsoever. He'll be facing his God someday.
We think about Tim a lot, especially during hunting season. It's a little bit of a melancholy feeling.
I know he's rusty now, and I'll meet him up there one of these days, probably sooner than I think. Time flies.
哎，真不，我说这不是一个级别的，那个，哎，这200不算贵，比北京那便宜。哎，我跟北京跳那个，就刚才你们看那视频，那是一个小湖，你知道吧？那个小湖，你给人感觉吧，反正也挺吓人。我操，这他妈面对整个大海，从他妈那往下跳，远处，哎呦，我操，那制空感，妈吓死个人呀！吓死个人呀！这主观体验是什么？哦，玩3D 啊！哦，这是玩3D 的。
Wonder if I could bring them to live. I could bring my lover. And baby, you make me wait. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Play the music back there again. Play the music back there again. I saw the looking out of the window. Wonder if I could bring them down. If I could bring my love now, baby, you make.
Shorty, if you really wanna go, baby, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my drama, gave my simple, gave my friends a helping hand. I bet you know that they are dead. I wish I could tell you this. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. The more we talk, the talk is not a tongue. I did not come this far for any stronger. All of a sudden there was nothing left. Well, last night a doctor thought you were lying. I never meant to keep you alive. There might be stuff we said that sound dumb to you, but to get a red wine